I've told this story maybe 4 times in my life, twice while drunk, once to a review board that didn't believe me, and now to you. I'm going to tell it right this time. My name doesn't matter much. Call me Halloran. I was a cargo loader on Vessel 7 of the Deep Reach convoy, and I had exactly one skill worth anything. I could tell when a machine was about to die. Not from readouts, from sound. My mother worked shipyards on Callisto, and she taught me that machines complain before they quit, same as people. That skill is the only reason I'm alive, to tell you about Myra Vance. But that's not really the story. The story is about what happened when something that had never wanted anything in 900 years decided it wanted her. Let me set the scene. Deep Reach was a salvage convoy. 6 vessels, 411 human beings, contracted out to strip the bones of a dead war. The conquered conflict had ended before I was born, and it left behind a graveyard built out past the Tarik Drift, hulks the size of cities, drifting cold, packed with alloys nobody could synthesize anymore. We went out, we cut them apart, we came home with our holds full of metal that made other people rich. It was ugly work, honest work. You came back with scars and a paycheck and a story or two. I want you to picture the environment, because the environment matters. Out in the drift there is no up. There's no day. The nearest star is a red pinprick that gives you about as much light as a cigarette held at arm's length. Everything you see because you brought the light with you. Our floods threw white cones across those hulks, and the cones were full of debris, flakes of hull paint, frozen coolant, bone dust if you were unlucky, and it drifted through the beams like snow that had forgotten which way was down. The sound was the worst part. You think space is silent. It's not when you're inside a suit. Inside a suit you hear your own breathing, you hear the little servos in the joints, you hear the coolant loop ticking behind your neck, and after 8 hours of that you start hearing things that aren't there. Guys used to hum to themselves. Constantly. You get on comms and it'd be 4 men humming 4 different tunes into an open channel, and nobody ever mentioned it because everybody did it. The ships we sailed were ugly, honest things. Vessel 7 was a Cascade-class hauler, 90 years old, and she groaned when she burned. Her fusion torch was a temperamental antique, and the shielding was patched with plates we'd scavenged off other wrecks, so half our hull was mismatched metal, gray and green and rust-colored, like a quilt made by somebody who'd stopped caring. Inside, the corridors were narrow enough that 2 people had to turn sideways to pass. The air smelled like burnt oil and recycled sweat, and the faint chemical sweetness of the scrubbers. We had cutter rigs, big exosuits with plasma lances mounted on the forearms. Ours were third-hand Vulcan Mk4, and they were older than most of the crew. You had to bleed the lance capacitors by hand every 12 hours or they'd cook off. The safety interlocks had been removed by some previous owner and never replaced. You could burn your own leg off if you sneezed wrong. That was our world. Loud, cold, mismatched, held together with tape and spite. And into that world came Myra Vance. She joined us at Ostro Station. I remember because it was raining inside the station. The humidity regulators had failed on the upper decks, and condensation was falling from the ceiling in this fine, constant drizzle. Everyone was miserable. The whole concourse smelled like wet metal. She came down the gangway with a duffel over one shoulder and water in her hair, and she looked around at all of us like she was checking the exits. She wasn't impressive. That's the thing everybody gets wrong when they tell it later. They make her sound like a hero from the start. She wasn't. She was maybe 5'4", thin in the way people get when they've been eating ration paste for too long, and she had a haircut she'd clearly given herself with a utility blade. Her jacket was too big. Her boots were too good, actually new, which nobody had, and I noticed that and filed it away and didn't think about it again for a long time. Our foreman was a man named Bosch. Big guy. Not cruel, just tired, and tired men can seem cruel. He looked at her manifest and looked at her and said, "You've done cutting." Some, he handed the slate back. Where? Around. Bosch let it go, because he needed hands and she had two of them. That was it. That was the whole beginning. For the first 6 weeks she was nobody. She worked. She kept her head down. She had this habit of eating alone in the aft stairwell instead of the mess, sitting on the steps with her bowl on her knees, and people made fun of her for it, but gently, the way you make fun of a stray cat. Somebody started calling her Stairs. It stuck a little. She never seemed to mind. She was quiet, but she wasn't shy, and there's a difference that took me a while to see. Shy people apologize for taking up space. Myra never apologized for anything. She just didn't feel the need to fill silence. You'd be standing next to her in the airlock for 4 minutes and she'd say nothing at all, and it wasn't awkward, it was just quiet, like standing next to a wall. I liked her because of the machines. 3rd week in, we were prepping the cutter rigs and I was doing my usual thing, running my hand along the number 4 rig's shoulder joint while the servo cycled, listening to it. And Myra stopped and watched me for a second and then said, out of nowhere, "That one's about to go." I looked at her. What? The rig, that joint, it's about 1100 hertz, should be 1250. Nobody talked like that. Nobody but me and my mother. You can hear that, I said. And she gave this little half shrug, like she'd said something embarrassing, and went back to what she was doing. Sometimes. I pulled that rig from rotation. 2 days later, the shoulder actuator fragged itself in the shop and put a piece of tungsten through the ceiling. After that, I paid attention to her. Here's what I noticed over those weeks in no particular order. She never sat with her back to a door. She could do arithmetic in her head faster than the slates could, and she'd catch herself doing it and then pretend to use the slate anyway. Her hands. She had scars on the backs of her hands, thin, precise, parallel, 4 on the left and 3 on the right. Not work scars. Work scars are ugly and random. These looked deliberate, surgical almost. And once when a coolant line burst in the number 2 bay and everybody jumped, she didn't. She turned toward it. Everybody's body says away when something explodes. Hers said toward. That's not something you can train into a person in a few years. That's something that gets built into you. I didn't put it together. I want to be honest about that. Later people asked me, didn't you know? Didn't you suspect? And no, I didn't. I just thought she was strange and interesting, and I was 34 and lonely, and I like strange, interesting people. I didn't know she was carrying something. I sure as hell didn't know what was already looking for her. We found the Valeth in the 8th week. Understand, we found things all the time. That was the job. Conquerdera hulks mostly. Human ships, because humans lost that war badly and left a lot of dead metal out there. Occasionally we'd find something from the other side, the Vaskal Ascendancy, the people who'd beaten us, but their salvage was rare because they collected their own dead. They were tidy that way, tidier than us. The Valeth was not tidy. Bosch called us up to the bridge to look at the long scan, and the whole crew crammed in because we could tell from his face that it was something. On the display, it looked like a cathedral that had been dropped from a great height. Vaskal architecture, if you've never seen it, is all curves and ribs and long tapering spines. It's grown, not built. They use these bioceramic hulls that they seed and cultivate over decades. So their ships look like something that died and fossilized. Beautiful in a way that makes your stomach hurt. This one was 4 kilometers long and broken into 3 pieces, and it had been drifting out there for a very long time. The scan showed hull temperature at about 9 Kelvin. That's dead. That's dead and cold and forgotten dead. That's a warship, somebody said. That's a cruiser, Bosch corrected. Ascendancy line cruiser. Look at the spine mounts. Are we allowed to? It's in the neutral belt. It's ours if we can cut it. There was a silence, and then a kind of ragged cheer, because everybody was doing the same math. A Vaskal cruiser's hull was worth more than everything we'd cut in the last 2 years combined. That bioceramic couldn't be manufactured by anyone. It could only be harvested. We were all thinking about money. I remember I looked over at Myra, and she was not thinking about money. She had gone very, very still, and her face had done something I'd never seen it do. It had emptied out completely. No expression at all, like somebody had turned her off. She was looking at the display the way you look at a dog that's just started growling. We spent 4 days getting rigged for it. I want to tell you about the 4th night, because that's the last normal night, and I've thought about it a lot. We were in the mess. Somebody had produced actual alcohol from somewhere, Kessler probably. He always had a still going in the water reclamation bay, and there were maybe 15 of us packed around the 2 long tables. The lights were down because half the panels were dead and nobody had replaced them. The air handler was making its awful sound, this rhythmic chunk-chunk hiss, and after 2 years I couldn't sleep without it. People were happy, loud. There's a specific kind of loud that crews get when they think a big payday is coming, and it's not really about the money, it's about the permission to imagine a different life for a few hours. Bosch was going to buy a house. Kessler was going to buy a boat on a planet on actual water, which nobody believed he'd ever do. A woman named Oyalaran was going to pay for her sister's surgery, and she said it about 6 times because she was drunk and it mattered to her. And I found myself sitting across from Myra, who was drinking water and watching all of it. "You're not celebrating," I said. "I'm here." "That's not the same thing." She turned her cup around on the table. Once, twice. She had a way of thinking with her hands that I found, I'll just say it, I found lovely. I was already in trouble by that point and I knew it and I was managing it badly. "Halloran," she said, "have you ever cut a Vascal ship?" "No, nobody has. That's why we're excited." "Nobody has because they don't leave them behind." She said it quietly under the noise. "Ever. They send retrieval fleets. They've fought battles over corpses. They do not leave a cruiser drifting in a neutral belt for 90 years. I hadn't thought about that. "So why's this one out here?" I said. And she looked at me with those flat gray eyes and said, "That's what I'd like to know." The first cruise went in the next morning. We approached in the shuttles, little ugly boxes called mules, barely more than a cockpit and a cargo clamp. And I remember the exact moment the Valith stopped being a shape on a screen and started being a thing in front of us. The floodlights swept across it and the hull was white, not painted white, bone white. Under the light it had a faint iridescence, a pearl sheen, and there were ridges and channels running along it in patterns that weren't random. They were fractal, self-similar, like the veins in a leaf. Whole sections were cratered from weapons fire, and where the ceramic had cracked you could see down into it, layer under layer, and it went deep, deeper than seemed possible. Nobody talked on the approach. 12 people on an open channel and nobody said a word, which had never happened before. Bosch broke it. "All right, standard entry. Kessler, Oyalaran, you're on the hull breach. Halloran, you're with me on the spine. Vance." "I'll take the aft break," Myra said. "Vance, you're with Kessler." "I'll take the aft break," she said again, in exactly the same tone. There was a pause on the channel. Bosch, tired and not cruel. "Fine, take the aft break." I didn't understand at the time. Later I did. The aft break was where the reactor would be. She wasn't volunteering for salvage. She was volunteering to look at something. Inside it was worse. The corridors weren't corridors. They were passages, and they curved, and they had no corners at all. Everything flowed into everything else, and the walls had this soft ribbing that in the beam of your headlamp looked disturbingly like the inside of a throat. There was no gravity, obviously. 90 years dead. So we moved on tethers and mag boots, and the whole time the frozen air, actual frozen atmosphere in crystals, hanging in place where it had been when the hull cracked. The whole time it drifted around us and caught the light and glittered. It was the most beautiful place I have ever been. It was also the first time in my adult life I was actively afraid. And here's the thing that got under everybody's skin. There were no bodies. Not one. A 4-kilometer warship with a crew complement of probably 800 cracked open in battle, and there was not a single corpse anywhere. No remains. No debris of the personal kind. No tools, no gear, no belongings. The ship was swept. Kessler said on comms, "Maybe they evacuated." Bosch said, "Then why'd they leave the ship?" Nobody had an answer for that. We worked it for 11 days. I'm going to compress that because most of it was just work. Hard, cold, tedious work. We cut the outer plating in 3-meter sections and hauled it back on the mules, and it took forever because the bioceramic didn't cut like metal. It resisted, and then it gave all at once, and the first 2 days we lost a lot of lance capacitors learning that. But some things happened. Let me tell you about the things that happened in order because the order matters. Day 3. Oyalaran reported that her suit clock was wrong. She'd been out 4 hours and her clock said 6. We wrote it off as a fault. Day 4, 2 more clock faults, then a third. Bosch had the shop check the suits and they came back clean. Day 5. Kessler came back from a cut and he was pale and he wouldn't say why for about an hour, and then he told me privately in the corridor outside the mess. I heard singing. I said, "In your suit, people hum, Kess, everybody hums." Not humming. He was gripping his own wrist, hard enough that I could see the white of his fingers. Not humming, it was a language and it was underneath me, in the deck, and it wasn't coming through comms, Hal, it was coming through my boots. I didn't believe him. I want to be clear that I didn't believe him, and that I told him to get some sleep, and I have thought about that conversation nearly every day since. Day 6, Myra stopped sleeping. I know because I found her at 300 shipboard in the number 2 cutter bay, sitting on the deck with her back against a rig, staring at nothing. I sat down next to her, didn't say anything for a while. That was the thing you could do with her, you could just sit. Eventually she said, "It's not dead." "What isn't?" "The ship." I didn't laugh. "I want credit for that," I said. "The reactor's cold. I saw the readings myself, The reactor's cold," she agreed. "The ship isn't." She turned her head and looked at me and there were shadows under her eyes like bruises. "Vaskal ships have 2 minds, Halloran. There's the drive core, which is machine, and there's the lattice, which is—" She stopped, started again. "The lattice is grown into the hull. It doesn't need power. It's not electrical. It's a structural computation medium. It thinks the way a crystal thinks, slowly, using the strain in its own material." I stared at her. "How," I said very carefully, "do you know that?" And she didn't answer. She just closed her eyes and put her head back against the rig and said, "It's been awake this whole time, 90 years, alone, and now it can hear us walking around inside it." Okay, so let me stop and tell you about Myra Vance, because if I don't tell you now, the rest of it won't land. Everything I'm about to say, I learned afterward. From records I wasn't supposed to see, from a woman at a review board who took pity on me, and from what Myra herself told me at the very end, in a corridor, in about 90 seconds, while everything came apart. Myra Vance was not a salvage cutter. She had been, for 11 years, a deep contact interpreter with the human-conquered diplomatic corps. Interpreters were the strangest thing our species ever built. They were people, volunteers mostly, and I've never understood why anybody volunteered, who had been surgically and neurologically modified to interface directly with Vaskal lattice minds. Because the Vaskal didn't do language, not the way we do. They did state. They shared configurations of thought directly, mind to lattice to mind, and for a human to participate in that you had to have your brain rebuilt around a port. The scars on her hands were from the interface stigmata. The ports were in her palms. They'd been removed, but the tissue never healed right. 11 years. She'd sat across from Vaskal ship minds and translated. She'd been the seam between 2 species. And during the last months of the conquered conflict, when everything was falling apart, she'd been assigned to the negotiation team that was trying to end the war. She'd been good at it. That's the part that hurts. She was one of the best they ever produced. And on the 13th of Messer, in a year I won't name, she had been the interpreter aboard a human cruiser called the Salient Reach, in a standoff with a Vascal line cruiser in the neutral belt for 11 hours, trying to broker a ceasefire. The Vascal ship was designated Valeth. She had been inside its mind. For 11 hours she had been jacked into that lattice, feeling it think, and it had been feeling her think back. And then the ceasefire collapsed. Somebody on our side, not her, and I want that on the record, not her, somebody on our side fired first. The Salient Reach put 4 spinal lances through the Valeth while Myra was still connected to it. She felt it die. Or she felt it nearly die, which as it turns out is much worse. She was in the lattice when the hull cracked. She was in the lattice when 800 Vascal decompressed. She was in the lattice, sharing the state of a mind that was watching its own crew freeze, and then somebody on the Salient Reach hit the emergency disconnect and tore her out of it. They found her 4 hours later, in a service crawlspace, having clawed the ports out of her own palms with a screwdriver. She spent 2 years in psychiatric detention. She was discharged with no pension, no record, and a note in her file that said, and I've seen this, I have actually seen this sentence. Subject remains a security consideration due to persistent unauthorized lattice affinity. Persistent unauthorized lattice affinity. What that means in plain language is this: the Valeth had not let her go. Day 7, Kessler went into a wall. That's the only way I can describe it. He was working a cut on the 3rd deck and his tether was fine and his boots were fine and he just turned and walked into the bulkhead and kept walking, kept pushing. His servos were screaming. When Bosch and I got to him, his faceplate was cracked and he was pressed against that white ceramic with both palms flat, and he was talking. Not to us. I got a hand on his shoulder and hauled him back and he came away easy, like there was nothing in him, and I got a look at his face through the cracked plate. His eyes were wet, he was crying, and he looked at me and he said on the open channel so everybody heard, "It wants her back." Bosch called an all-stop. We pulled every crew off the Valeth and we sat in the mess, all of us, 40-odd people crammed in there, and Bosch stood at the front with his hands on the table and said, "Somebody tell me what is happening on my job." Nobody said anything. And then Myra Vance stood up. I remember she had to squeeze past 4 people to get out from the table. I remember she straightened her jacket, this stupid little gesture, like she was about to give a presentation. I remember thinking, absurdly, she's about to make it worse. She said, "It's my fault." And then she told them. All of it. Standing there in that grimy mess hall with the air handler going chunk hiss, she told 40 tired people that she had been a deep contact interpreter, that she had been inside that ship's mind during the war, that she had been there when it was killed, and that it had been holding on to a piece of her ever since. The room did not react well. I want to be honest about that too. There was no dignified silence. People were furious. Oyalaren was shouting. Somebody threw a cup. A rigger named Dusk got right up in her face and screamed that she'd killed us all, that she'd hidden it, that she'd taken a contract on a salvage ship and gone looking for the thing that ruined her and dragged 41 strangers along. And Myra just stood there and took it. She didn't defend herself. Not once. She just stood there with her hands at her sides and let them scream at her, and I watched her face and it was doing that thing again, that emptied-out thing, and I finally understood what it was. It was the face of someone who agreed with every word. Bosch shut it down, eventually. He was good at that. He got the room quiet, and then he asked her the only question that mattered. "Can it hurt us?" And Myra said, "It's been trying not to." That landed like a brick. "Say that again," Bosch said. "For 11 days, she said, it has been trying not to hurt you. It's been trying to reach me and everything you've experienced, The clocks, the singing, Kessler, that's the overflow. That's what it looks like when something 4 kilometers long tries to whisper. She swallowed. It's very old and it's very lonely and it is not sane. It has been alone in the dark for 90 years with nothing to think about except the 11 hours it spent knowing me. Somebody said, then talk to it, tell it to leave us alone. Myra looked at the floor. If I connect to it, she said, I won't come back. We voted. That's the part nobody believes. But we did. Bosch made us. 41 people in a mess hall voting on whether to abandon 400 million credits of hull and run. The vote was 36-5 to leave. I voted to leave. Myra voted to leave. She wanted more than anything to leave. Bosch gave the order and we started prepping the burn, and for about 9 hours I actually believed we were going to make it. And I want you to sit with that for a second, because I have sat with it for 11 years. 9 hours. We couldn't burn. The mules wouldn't disengage. The clamps had fused, not welded, fused. The metal had gone soft and flowed and resolidified around the hull anchors, and there wasn't a torch on the ship that would touch it. The nav computer wouldn't accept a course. Every heading we entered came back with the same fault code, over and over. Bosch tried to fly her manual and the helm wouldn't answer. And then the deck started to sing. Kessler had been right. It came up through the boots. It was subsonic mostly. You felt it more than heard it in your teeth and your sternum. But there was a top edge to it that was almost audible and it was structured. It rose and fell. It repeated. It was a phrase and it was being repeated over and over, patient as a heartbeat. I found Myra in the aft stairwell. Of course. Sitting on the steps like always, hands over her ears, and she was rocking very slightly, and she was saying something under her breath, and when I got close enough I heard what it was. She was saying, I know, I know, I know, I know. I sat down next to her on that step. The singing came up through the metal into my hip and my ribs, and it was, God help me, it was beautiful. That's the thing nobody warns you about. It wasn't menacing. It was the most beautiful sound I have ever heard, and I would have followed it into anything. Halloran, she said. She didn't take her hands from her ears. Go away. No. It'll take you too. It's already taking Kessler, I said. It took Dust this morning, did you hear? He's in the medbay with both hands broken because he was trying to dig through a bulkhead. Oya Laren won't come out of her rack. It's taking all of us. She was quiet a long time. Then she said, it isn't cruel. It's killing us. It doesn't know that. And she finally looked up and her face was wrecked, absolutely wrecked, and she said, it doesn't understand that we're separate. It never did. That was always the problem. That was the whole problem with the war. They don't have a concept for a mind that ends at the skin. It thinks you're all me. It thinks I've been standing outside its door for 90 years in 40 pieces, refusing to come in. She told me the rest of it in that stairwell. The interpreter program, the ports, the 11 hours, the disconnect. And she told me one more thing, which she had not told the mess hall, and which I have never told anyone until right now. She said that in the 11th hour, right before the shooting started, the Valeth had shown her something. The Vaskal don't have art. They don't have music. What they have instead is a thing she couldn't translate, and she said the closest she could get was the state of having been witnessed. It's a configuration of mind. It's what happens when a thing that has always been alone is, for one moment, fully seen by something else and not destroyed. And the Valeth, on the last day of a war it was losing, in the 11th hour of a negotiation that was about to fail, had opened itself completely to a human being and given her that. It gave me the only thing it had, she said, and then my people shot it. She wiped her face with the heel of her hand, very fast, like she was angry at herself. It isn't obsessed with me because it's a monster, she said. It's obsessed with me because I'm the only thing in the universe that was ever kind to it, and it has spent 90 years alone in the dark, and I have spent 90 years not coming back. End of Part 1. Part 2. The convoy tried to help us, I should say that. Vessels 3 and 5 came about and put lines on us and tried to haul us off, and their engines ran hot for 6 hours and moved us exactly nothing, because we weren't being held by the clamps anymore. By hour 30, the hull ribbing on our own ship had started to change. I don't know how else to say it. The corridors of Vessel 7, old steel, 90 years of paint, my home, had begun very slowly to develop ridges. Long, soft, self-similar ridges. In the beam of a hand lamp they had a faint pearl sheen. It wasn't attacking us, it was including us. Kessler died on hour 38. He got into a cutter rig with the interlocks removed like all of ours, and he went out onto the Veilith's hull, and he pressed his lance against the ceramic and let it cook off. I don't think he was trying to kill himself. I think he was trying to knock on the door. Oyalaran went into the airlock without a suit on hour 41. Bosch got to her in time. Bosch got a hand on the door and held it shut with his own body while she screamed at him that she could hear her sister in there. Her sister was on Ostro Station. Her sister had never been within 4 light years of us. Bosch held that door for 19 minutes. There's a version of this story where I tell you about a battle, where the galactic soldiers come and there are guns and it's clean and somebody wins. That's not what happened. What happened is that on hour 52, a Vaskal Ascendancy retrieval flotilla arrived. 3 ships. They came out of transit right on top of us, closer than anyone should ever come, and they lit us up with something that wasn't quite a scan and wasn't quite a weapon, and every screen on Vessel 7 filled with white. The Ascendancy had been listening. Of course they had been listening. A dead lattice mind that starts singing after 90 years is not a quiet event. They had come, at flank speed from wherever they were, to recover the Veilith. And when they got here, they found 41 humans crawling around inside it. They boarded us. I have never been so frightened, and I have been frightened a great deal. The Vaskal are tall, taller than the vids show, and they don't walk exactly. They have this rolling, deliberate gait, and their carapace makes a sound like a hand running over dry paper. They came through our airlock in hard shells the color of old ivory, and they carried weapons I did not recognize, and they filled the corridor completely, shoulder to shoulder, wall to wall. We were on our knees in the mess, all of us. Bosch had ordered it. He'd said on the shipwide, in a voice I'd never heard from him, nobody fights, get on your knees and put your hands out. And I remember looking down the length of that mess hall at 30-odd people kneeling on a deck that was growing ribs, and thinking that we were about to be executed as scavengers, and that we deserved it. They didn't execute us. They stood there, motionless, for 11 minutes, and nobody moved and nobody spoke, and there was nothing but the sound of our own breathing and that terrible dry paper sound of their shells, and underneath everything, coming up through the deck, the singing. They were listening to it. They were listening to their dead ship sing, and they did not understand it either. And then Myra Vance walked into the room. She came through the aft hatch. She had taken her jacket off. She'd rolled her sleeves and she was holding her hands out in front of her, palms up, showing the scars. The Vaskal turned. All of them together, instantly, like a single organism. She said something. I don't know what. It wasn't a language. It was a sound like a struck bell and a sound like a door closing and a sound like grief, and she made it with her throat and her hands together, and I have never heard a human being make a noise like that before or since. The tall one at the front, I could not have told you it was an officer, but it was. The tall one at the front went absolutely still. And then it lowered its weapon. And then very slowly it lowered itself, down onto that crusted, growing, ribbed deck, onto what passed for its knees. And the others followed. 30 Vaskal warriors, in a human mess hall, kneeling in front of a 5'4" salvage cutter with her palms turned up. Bosch was next to me and I heard him say under his breath, "What is she?" They knew her. That's the thing. That's the thing I didn't understand until later. They knew her name, every one of them. It was in their records, in their song, in whatever they use for history. The interpreter who was inside the Veilith when it died. She was not a stranger to them. She was the last thing their ship had ever loved. She talked to them for 2 hours. I couldn't follow it. Nobody could. It was mostly silence and gesture and those impossible sounds, and once she put her hand flat against the deck and held it there, and every Vascal in the room made the paper sound at once. At the end of it, she came over to where Bosch was kneeling, and she crouched down in front of him and she said, "They'll let you go." Bosch said, "All of us?" She said, "Yes." And Bosch, who was not a stupid man, and who had been holding an airlock door shut with his body for 19 minutes, and who I had never once seen cry, looked at her and said, "All of us, Vance." She didn't answer him. She stood up and looked around the room at 30-odd filthy, terrified salvage cutters kneeling on a deck that was turning into something else, and I swear to God she smiled. Small, crooked, almost embarrassed. Then she turned to me, just me. She said, "It won't stop, not while I'm alive and out of reach. It'll follow the convoy. It'll follow you home." She said it very fast, very quiet, the way you say a thing you've rehearsed so you don't lose your nerve. The only way it stops is if it gets what it's been asking for. "Myra. It's not a monster, Halloran." Her voice cracked right down the middle and she didn't fix it. "It's just been alone, and I left. And I've never once in 90 years been able to explain to anyone why that's the worst thing I ever did." I got up off my knees. I got up and I got a hand around her arm, and I want you to know that I held on. She looked down at my hand. Then she looked up at me, and she said the last thing she ever said to me, and I have carried it for 11 years. She said, "Somebody has to go in there and stay." She unclamped a mule herself. The Vascal led her. They stood in our airlock corridor in 2 rows and they made a passage for her, and as she went past each one, they touched the wall with one hand. Every single one of them. I was in the observation blister when the mule burned. I watched that ugly little box cross 2 kilometers of nothing, and I watched the floodlights of the Veilith come up to meet it, and I watched it go into a crack in that bone-white hull and disappear. The singing stopped 4 minutes later. Not faded, stopped. Between one beat and the next, and the silence that came after was the loudest thing I have ever heard in my life. And then the Veilith moved. 90 years cold, and it moved. The clamps let go of us all at once, and the great broken pieces of it turned slowly, the way something turns in its sleep, and the 3 Vascal ships took station around it, and they went away together into the dark. Nobody fired a shot. The whole thing start to finish, and nobody fired a shot. We limped home. Vessel 7 was a mess. The ribbing in the corridor stayed. It never went away. It never grew any further either, and the company scrapped her within the year because nobody would sail in a ship with walls like that. Bosch quit. Oyalaren quit. Dusk got his hands fixed and went planetside, and I heard he sells insurance now, which is either very funny or very sad. I've never been able to decide. The review board did not believe me. They wrote it up as a chemical event, coolant leak, mass hysteria, a crewman's suicide, an unauthorized departure by a woman with a documented psychiatric history. The Ascendancy said nothing, because the Ascendancy never says anything. Myra Vance is listed as missing, presumed deceased. Cause, unauthorized vessel departure. Contributing factor, untreated psychiatric condition. That's it, that's her whole file. 11 years as the seam between 2 species and 41 lives, and they gave her 1 line and a contributing factor. I've thought about it every day. People want it to be a horror story. The thing in the dark that fixated on a woman and destroyed her. And I understand that, I do, because I was there and there were nights on that ship when I would have believed anything. But that's not what I saw. What I saw was something that had been shown one moment of kindness in 900 years and had never, ever gotten over it. What I saw was a mind so old and so alone that it did not have a word for goodbye, because it had never needed one, because nothing had ever come close enough to leave. It wanted her, and it did not know how to want a thing without swallowing it. And she knew that. She knew that on the first day, when she stood on that bridge and went pale and empty and quiet. She knew what was on the other end of that scan, and she got on the mules and went out there anyway day after day, for 11 days, because she was terrified and because she was ashamed and because somewhere underneath all of it, I think, she was the only person alive who felt sorry for it. It cost her everything, her career, her hands, her name, and at the end, when there was nothing else left to give, it cost her the rest. I don't think she was taken. I think she went. There's a thing I do now, and I'll tell you, and then I'll stop. Ostro Station has a promenade with a big observation port, and once a year I go out there and I get a drink and I sit and I look at the drift. You can't see anything. It's just black. The drift is too far out and too cold and there's nothing to see. But I sit there anyway, and I put my hand flat on the glass, and I hold it there for a while. Because somewhere out there is a mind 4 kilometers long that spent 90 years being unbearably lonely. And somewhere inside it is a small, tired, gray-eyed woman who finally stopped running. And I hope, I really do hope, that it was worth it. I hope she got there and it was quiet. I hope wherever they are now, that neither one of them is alone. Some people are haunted by monsters. She was haunted by something that only ever wanted to be seen, and in the end, that turned out to be the harder thing to survive.